I wanted to give you an overview of some of the central theories that we use in my field, especially in the social impact space. So one of our favorites is the socio-ecological model. So what we love about this model is that it's one of the simplest ways to show people that the way that they make decisions is not independent of what's around them. So you can see the individual is in the inner circle, but we are all influenced by the schools we went to, our work environment, our family, the institutions and policies that we live under, and even we could also be influenced by what's happening globally, right? So a lot of people like to think that they're making decisions super independently of everything else around them, but that's just not true. So this model is it's something that I use quite often, especially if I want to talk to people about psychology and I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty. I just try to give them this visual that they're definitely not as independent as they like to think that they are. So this is also one of the core concepts of how we think about project design, that the individual is not independent from what's around them. My personal favorite is social cognitive theory. Albert Bandura has influenced my thinking a lot. One of my favorite thinkers. And what I really loved the most about social cognitive theory is that it was one of the first times where we kind of understood the concept of vicarious learning. So this idea that a lot of the things that we learn to do are based on us copying other people doing the thing. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the bonobo doll experiments, for example. So this has been super key in especially solidifying ideas around self-efficacy and the importance of social norms and those environmental factors. So this is also one of the most influential theories in the social impact space. And again, we're looking at the individual holistically, right? So we're looking at cognitive factors alongside the environmental factors and the behavioral factors. So again, the individual is not so outside of their environment. The next one that's wonderful and still quite popular in my space is theory planned behavior. And this has been super important as well because of the highlight of beliefs, right? So for us to sort of understand why people intend to do something, we need to try to understand what those underlying beliefs are. So in our field of work, I would say that one of the biggest contributions has been how do you actually measure things like attitudes, right? So the theory planned behavior has a really wonderful accompanying guide for how to design questionnaires that will elicit beliefs, attitudinal beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs. So this has been really important in helping us to try and understand and survey people, actually. So I designed a TBP questionnaire when I did my research in psychology. I went to Ghana to do some work around condom use and the traditional factors that influence condom use. So this was quite instrumental for me in designing that questionnaire and helping me to get people to or to elicit those underlying beliefs, especially the traditional beliefs. So TBP is still quite big. Diffusion of innovation theory is also quite important. So now we are touching more on communications and sociology. And this is just the reality of how we work with behavioral science in social impact. So we rely quite a lot on comms theories as well as sociology. By the way, if something is unclear, just feel free to ask. I don't mind being interrupted as I talk. So diffusion of innovation is important when we are also trying to tackle things that are quite taboo and controversial. So a lot of the people that work in my sector will work with things like child marriage, for instance, or things like gender-based violence. And so these have very deep social and cultural structures, and they take a very, very long time to change. So we're looking for those social networks that we can leverage to, to help people kind of move along that journey. And so it helps us to design and understand what are the levers. So who are those early innovators, and how can we get them to be agents of change as well. Then last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Cialdini. Super important, super influential. This is that distinction between descriptive norms and injunctive norms in his theory of normative conduct is super central to a lot of what we do. It's something that a lot of practitioners who are not trained in psychology get wrong, and it can have quite detrimental effects to program design. A lot of people who are not trained in psychology confuse social norms, so descriptive norms and injunctive norms, with attitudes, but they're not the same thing. So this distinction of descriptive norms as that we need to see people doing the behavior, modeling the behavior that we want, that is something that needs to be researched separately from injunctive norms, which are what are the expectations. So for example, what am I expected to do, or how am I expected to behave as an African woman in a certain context? So as you can see, these two concepts are quite different. So we're trying to understand what behaviors are modeled versus what is expected. And this is still not attitudes, right? So a lot of people still confuse all of those things. So this theory is really important in helping us to understand how to research those concepts. Another important contribution from Cialdini, and actually what he is better known for, is the psychology of persuasion and the 7 universal principles of influence. And this is super popular in the private sector. So Cialdini's work is very influential in marketing. And so this helps us also in designing communication campaigns, for example. So we know, for instance, that we often need to have an element of social proof. So we want to show people how many others have already adopted the behavior. That will make it more likely for them to do it. We also need to take into account who the authority is. So the messenger effect would be really important. So we use these principles quite a lot when we're designing communication campaigns. I hope we are still together.
Definitely. Also.
Okay, so most of the time, it's very rare that somebody like me, so who works in social impact, is using one theory. What we're often doing is combining insights across different fields and sectors. And oftentimes we'll also include insights from other areas, simply because we will be working, let's say I'll give you an example later on childhood immunization, where you'll see it come to life. But often we are part of a multidisciplinary team. So we'll have, like, for instance, public health experts, we'll have policy experts, and then we would be the behavioral insights experts as part of a larger team. So we need to be able to think on multiple levels. So some people ask me, like, why bother, right? Like, what is the point of using behavioral science? And I have at least 5 very good reasons that I often give them. First of all, we want to think about behaviors as much as possible. So if we want to design for change, it's really important for us to be thinking about, what is it that I actually want the person to do? Yeah, because that will make it much more tangible and measurable if we understand what it is that we want people to do, and then design backwards from that. So what is the desired behavior, and design for it? Yeah. It also helps us to improve quality because we are using evidence. So we don't start the process without research. So everything that we do needs to be rooted and grounded on formative research. And I'll also share with you how we usually do that. but we're not going to design something just because of vibes or because we think it's cool. It needs to be based on some sort of research. It helps us to check our assumptions, and this is super difficult, especially when you're working, for instance, with people in a Ministry of Health. They will say, yeah, but we've been working with this community for years, so we know what the problem is or we know what they need. No, you don't. So you often still need to go back and ask questions and test. It also helps us to cut waste. So if we use a behavioral science and behavioral design process, we are going to be required to test the intervention before we roll it out to a larger segment. So that will help us figure out whether it's working or not, right? And then we can just end things if we know that this specific intervention doesn't work. And so just by that process of elimination, we would be cutting waste by spending tons of resources on something that doesn't work. And then my last and favorite reason is that it helps us to focus on people. So the process just forces us to go back to the people we are designing for. And, by that process, we are zooming in a lot more on people.